What are they brewing about? Well, I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. All right. Well, today I'd like to welcome Winton Higgins to the Mindful Cranks. Winton, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
I think it's the first time I've had someone on from down under, and you're located in Sydney, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Well, maybe we'll talk later about what's been going on down there in terms of the fires and things. But I came across your work probably about 6-7 years ago. I remember reading a paper. Perhaps you presented it or you participated at some special seminar at Bari, the Insight Meditation Society and Secular Buddhism. And that's when I first ran across you. Yeah, that's when I first ran across your work. And since then, I've stumbled across a number of your papers, and so you've been very active in secular Buddhism. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And how did that path unfold to end up where you are with being quite I think you're a teacher at a center there.
Yes, that's right. I'm a senior teacher with Sydney Insight Meditators. So my Dharmic career, I suppose, started with Insight Meditation. And I've been teaching retreats and teaching meditation classes since 1995. The secular bit started very slowly and gradually and without a name, really. I suppose the best place to start would be the first visit by Stephen and Martine Batchelor to Sydney in 2004. It really struck a chord with me, and I suppose I've been watching their development particularly. They've come back various other times, about 3 other visits to Sydney and elsewhere in Australia and New Zealand. And it's we've struck up a friendship, and so that's, I guess, Stephen's work has been my main road into secular Buddhism, but it's also been very much informed by the fact that I've been an academic in the politics discipline, particularly associated with genocide, Scandinavian social democracy and political theory, which have kind of fed into my interest in secular Buddhism as well.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. Your day job, so to speak, is as an academic in a political science department, or?
Yes, that's right. I mean, one of my key focuses was on the relationship between ethics and politics. So, especially in the modern world, politics has such an enormous efficacy that it didn't have in ancient times. So while, the ancients were reasonably enough not so interested in politics, at least in places outside Greece and the Roman Republic, in our own time, most of the calamities that befall us are the result of deliberate human action and deliberate policy settings. So that's been a particular interest that's converged with my understanding of the Dharma as an ethical path.
Well, that's really interesting. Now, I may be getting off the beaten path here, but let me just probe a bit. The Stoics, they were were they instrumental in Greek politics? What role did they play? Do you know much about that sort of ancient philosophy and how they viewed politics from this kind of that perspective?
Well, I suppose the chief Stoic that I know of is Seneca, and he certainly was involved to a certain extent with in Roman politics. I'm not sure that the Stoics played such a big role in Greek politics. I think the skeptics and the Epicureans were more involved.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, they were all part of the debates going on the Agora when such still important doctrines like civic republicanism were being developed.
Yeah, and I remember reading a paper recently on the role of equanimity. In other words, the equanimity among the Stoics and Epicureans was seen as a cultivation of character, but within a community. And I think that's very different than how our understanding of equanimity now, let's say within the mindfulness field, has been seen as kind of like a physiological state of calm. And I wonder if we've lost something by seeing it as a kind of a biophysical, biological interpretation of or reduction. Whereas, if you go to the ancients and the Epicureans, the Stoics, we're looking at, they're seeking equanimity, but it's not to reduce blood pressure per se.
Well, yeah, I mean, their understanding of equanimity would have been as a communal project.
A communal project.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's how Greek philosophy understood as practical reason, how it worked, that, this or that philosopher would come up with a particular view of how the good life was to be led, and would attract followers, and they'd go off and create a whole community. Like, the skeptics in Greek times developed actual communities based on the premise that one didn't hold views about anything that wasn't immediately obvious. So that was seems to me a very healthy position to take. One can believe in the law of gravity, but not necessarily the law of God. So but the communitarian aspect was very interesting, and that, of course, gets completely lost when Buddhism is sold in the West as a kind of hyper-individualistic way of tuning out.
Yeah. Maybe we'll come back to this whole. I think you talk about it in terms of the communitarian imperative. Maybe we'll circle back to that. But going back to secular Buddhism, you have a paper, and I think you make a very interesting distinction between what you're calling a kind of a schism or a split, even within secular Buddhist communities, between the scientistic versus the interpretive camps, if you want to use that word. Can you say a little bit about what you mean by these two dimensions and how they're playing out?
Yes, I think one of the unfortunate things that happened in the late 19th century when Buddhism first became noticed in the West was it became known as the scientific religion, and that was partly because of the intellectual battles that were being raged in the West between Darwinism, biological evolution on the one hand and Christian doctrine on the other. So Buddhism seemed to offer for a lot of people a religion that was perfectly accommodating to science, particularly biological evolutionism and psychology, which was also starting up in the late 19th century. So this became a kind of accreditation card for Buddhism in the West. And to my mind, it's a rather unfortunate development. I mean, science is something that I strongly approve of, but I don't think Buddhism has a great deal to do with it. Rather, Buddhism is much more, let's say, the Buddha's own teaching, the Dharma, has much more to do with how we interpret our experience and how we interpret our world and our place in it than it has to do with, things like neuroscience and so-called, laws of cognitive psychology. So I found that an interesting aspect of this is now a kind of cultural one. What struck me in that conference in Barrie, Massachusetts, was how strong the link was between scientific disciplines and the way American secular Buddhists went about their work. And I had a sort of a theory that this is because the US is probably the most religified Western culture. And so, these sort of battles between religion and science are still going on there. Whereas, in Europe and down here in New Zealand and Australia, we're much more interested in the convergence or the elective affinity, I guess you could say, between the Dharma and interpretive philosophy. Philosophy since Nietzsche, which has completely abandoned metaphysical truth propositions and truth regimes in order to look at how we actually interpret ourselves and what we're doing in the world, starting, I suppose, most spectacularly with Heidegger and being in time, his major work from 1927, but also including what you might call the children of Heidegger, like the existentialists and the more recent phenomenologists. So that seemed to be the much more fertile line in which to find resonances in Western culture between the Buddha's own teaching and how we understand ourselves now.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate reading of the U.S. In terms of its immersion in this kind of scientific Buddhism, this form of Buddhist modernism, which now Evan Thompson is calling a Buddhist exceptionalism, where somehow it wants to brand itself as being scientific, which he actually takes quite an issue with too now in his new book, which I'm planning on interviewing him down the road. So you're seeing this other strand of secular Buddhism, what you're calling the interpretive strand. What's different about it? I mean, what do you feel it's different about it that in comparison to the American strand?
Well, I guess the interpretive stream doesn't have much use for fMRI machines and scans and all that stuff. I think crucially it starts with the mode of our existence, and the story here starts with the Buddha's concept of anatta, or not self, and the way in which the Buddha treats the human person as more like a series of events rather than as an entity. And this is precisely the the view the view of human existence that you find in Heidegger. Where Heidegger won't even refer to the human person, but uses as kind of synonyms being in the world or being there. And that being is always changing moment to moment, and it doesn't stop at the skin. I mean, we're constantly in a relationship with things in our immediate environment and other people, and we are constantly on the way to death. And so that much more dynamic sense of what human being is that Heidegger develops, I think, gives us gives us a richer idea of what I think the Buddha was getting at. And certainly, if when you read the Satipatthana Sutta, the main teaching on insight meditation that the Buddha gave, and in fact on meditation in general, you can see this very clearly, that everything is just arising and passing away the whole time, and there's no choreographer, there's no permanent entity that it all refers to. It's one of the basic insights one gets from a 10-day intensive insight meditation retreat, that, you've seen 100,000 phenomena arising and passing away that have impinged on one's consciousness, but they don't refer to anybody. There's no one kind of hero of the story or choreographer of the dance.
Right. There's no bystander standing back, calling the shots. And
that's right. Yeah, I think it was actually Evan Thompson who used the expression that a human being is like a dance, and it depends on your culture and hearing the music and moving and all that sort of thing. But we're not the dancer, we're the dance.
Yeah, well, it sounds a lot like process philosophy, and also, Evan uses the term enacted cognition. As you said, it's relational. It's constantly in dynamic relationship with its surroundings. So that's interesting, because I think you've said in some of your talks that that one of the problems that you've observed, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is a lot of people have come to see mindfulness and meditation as a standalone practice. And what's problematic about that, if it is?
It's certainly highly problematic, I think, because it does lead to Buddhism being boxed in to just being a kind of a kind of self-help practice, as you yourself have argued very persuasively in your book on mindfulness. So it becomes a bit of an analgesic to a lot of people, and it's often marketed and produced in mass quantities in that way.
Right.
And what's important, I think, is that, I mean, this would strike anyone outside the West as highly peculiar, that Buddhism is certainly not reducible to meditation practice. In fact, in a lot of countries, a lot of Buddhist countries, they hardly meditate at all. I remember one of a really early book I read about Theravadan monks in post-war Asia. It showed that only 10% of Theravadan monks actually meditate in any serious way. In other words, not as a 10-minute ritual after puja or something like that. So the point is that when you locate where meditation sits in the Dharma, there it is in the Eightfold Path, and it's only a part of the path. And it's given that the path is itself a highly integrated idea of the good life, you can see that you're just confusing a part for the whole. And so people are meditating, but they don't know what to do, how to interpret, how to use their meditation experience. It's just a simple way of, calming down, a bit, equivalent to taking a run or going doing a few laps in the pool or something like that.
Right.
So
you might as well just use a meditation app if that's the case.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think the analogy is like taking a pill without having to examine or change your life. I mean, that becomes a palliative of some kind.
Yeah,
in that respect.
And not just a palliative, but I mean, as you yourself have pointed out in your book, it becomes a kind of moral alibi for corporate masters of the universe and such like folk that look at me, I'm a worthy person because I meditate, and don't talk to me about throwing people out of jobs or causing environmental destruction.
Yeah, it could become a fancy way of virtue signaling in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of like politicians who are always being photographed on Sunday mornings outside a little wooden church. This is to say, we're good people. Here we are.
Now, you make a really good point, and I think a lot of people have a hard time with this, that Buddhist ethics are they're not exactly equivalent to our Western Judeo-Christian way of thinking about ethics. In other words, they're not rule-based. And can you kind of elaborate your own sort of interpretation of how you see Buddhist ethics, both theoretically and maybe in practice, how that's played out for you in your own journey?
Well, I suppose I've always been impressed by the distinction made between morality and ethics. Ethics is about fundamental values that you're seeking to cultivate, whereas morality is usually a set of rules, like the Ten Commandments is a morality, whereas the 5 precepts, as properly understood, are a set of fundamental values to be cultivated in one's life. And like any kind of ethics, it has to be consequentialist. It has to look at the probable outcomes of any ethically significant choice we make. So this, I think, is why I'd far rather an ethical system than a moral system, even though, of course, moral systems can be derived from ethical systems. But it means that as a Dharma practitioner, one can take a much more nuanced view of some of the really big moral conundrums that we face in the West these days, like the abortion issue or the assisted dying issue, where it seems to me, that religious folk seem to think there are rules to be obeyed no matter what the outcome is.
Yeah. And how does that? Maybe it's a good point to bridge our way into talking about meditation and politics. You noted that in Buddha's time, one of the most important issues was to not be a victim of violence. I guess violence was the main threat. Whereas now, we're still seeing a lot of violence, but now it's a form of structural violence, if we want to put it that way.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a lot of debate going on about, should Buddhists be engaged or disengaged, or if we look at the Pali Canon, for example, some people would argue that there's a strong case to say that there's not much politics there. There's not much to go by to have a engaged form of Buddhism. And so I'm wondering where you stand on this, and what certainly you've been thinking about this a long time, given that your field is politics as well.
Yes, well, I think the idea that Buddhists should abstain from political activism, it really comes not from the Pali Canon, but it comes from the way in which the Buddha's tradition was turned into a religion from shortly after his death. And when it became religified, it also became institutionalized into big monastic establishments. And thereby the monastic elites and the temporal elites fell into bed with each other. They had much to offer each other. The monasteries ran on royal patronage, and religion does what religion has usually done around the world, which is to legitimate existing temporal rulers and existing temporal systems of rule, to legitimate them and to spread quietism among the faithful. And so when we move from the ancient times to modern times, something really, really important happens. One is, it is that in the Buddha's time, politics didn't matter. The things that basically didn't matter, the calamities that struck people were things like pestilence and flood and fire and earthquakes and all those sorts of things, and particularly diseases that are now easily curable. If you compare that situation to the one we're in now, but basically all the calamities to which we are subject are the result of human organisation and human decision-making. Even, calamitous weather events now are a result of human activity. Not to mention the 200 million people who were killed in the 20th century due to government decisions and government actions in waging wars, genocides, massacres, and so on. So just about everything that's going wrong in the world is a result of morally and ethically significant human action. And that's all about politics. So, while it was okay to abstain from politics 2,500 years ago in India, it's not okay anymore. To abstain from political activism now is a form of bystanderism, a really important problem in genocide studies.
Wow!
Because
bystanderism.
You can't have a genocide without the vast majority of the perpetrator population being able to accept what's going on, to look the other way, or to say, this doesn't have anything to do with me, I'm not political. And so the bystander really is to blame. And to my mind, this problem has been going on for some time. I've just read Christos Tsiolkas's latest book called Damascus, which is basically about St. Paul and the first decades after Jesus' death. And there's a fantastic conflict going on between Paul, who's an interventionist, and Thomas, supposedly the biological twin brother of Jesus, who who is advocating being a passerby, as it says in the novel, someone who just doesn't get involved, lets the world, go to hell in a handbasket and doesn't raise a finger to stop it. So I think this is quite an interesting retrieval of a battle that's been going on for some time, but in our own time, of course, it just seems to me inexcusable to be advocating political abstentionism, not least in the face of the disasters of climate change that are already upon us.
Yeah, when you use the word bystanderism, I think that it's extending to ecocide. I mean, the ecological crisis is. It seems like it's this phenomena of bystanderism is playing itself out in terms of how many people are still in denial of climate change or not knowing what they could do about it. But it's an interesting word, bystander, because it reminds me again of this idea that the self, that there is this notion of a self that's somehow standing behind phenomena, the idea of Atman. I'm wondering if there's a connection there in some ways.
I guess so, yeah. I mean, but particularly, the idea of Atman and the idea of a self, about a sort of fantastical individual existence and individual path that doesn't have anything to do with what's going on in the world. And I think that that idea is quite foreign to the Buddha's own teaching, and it certainly should be foreign to the way we think now. We are all intimately involved with this, and one of the ways in which this kind of individualism flourishes to appalling effect is in the rise of neoliberalism, which has been a kind of reigning dogma for Western governments, and not just Western governments, for the last 35 years. The whole idea that one must let market outcomes be, market mechanisms and market outcomes, one should not in any way interfere in the interests of social equity or social justice or alleviation of misery. And one should also not try and mess with markets when they are producing the current climate emergency. This whole idea of this whole laissez-faire idea is the kind of flip side of the coin of individual abstention, I think.
Well, yeah, there's an interesting point too. I also raised the issue that neoliberal ideology, in terms of how insidious it's become in terms of shaping a particular kind of self, one that has to look out for its own well-being, has to enhance its own mental capital. It's all about sort of upgrading one's market value as a self, as an entrepreneur, all this kind of thing. But also, I think there's a problematic, even in going back, as you mentioned, during early Buddhism. Monastics took a vow of voluntary poverty, but at the same time, they were taken care of, at least, food, clothing, and shelter. They weren't starving, either through royal patronage or through lay devotees. There was some sort of, they were being provided for. And I think from that perspective, I could see how the sources of suffering were seen as strictly as individual, no, I don't want to use the word individual, but the locale of the sources of suffering were within one's own mind stream, so to speak. So I guess where I'm taking this is that the focus was, a liberation was on individual salvation. Now, they certainly had a view of no self, but I think this is where the debate comes in when you say politics matters, is that I think that has to expand our way of understanding the source of suffering as not being exclusively limited to individual mind streams. In other words, the kleshas, the mental poisons, and things like that. Do you have something to elaborate on that, perhaps?
Well, yeah, look, I think it's just simply dishonest to suggest that poverty, starvation, social exclusion, and relative deprivation don't contribute to suffering. Yeah, it's just a ludicrous idea that suffering is all internally generated, in our individual mental malfunctionings. And again, it's that's that idea is simply a moral alibi for a socioeconomic system which is global, which is responsible for the maldistribution of wealth, income, life chances, medical care, clean water. All these things are the sources of suffering as well. Yeah. So some people talk about the first arrow and the second arrow after a famous parable of the Buddhas about the man who is shot with a poisoned arrow, and his friends call a doctor, and the wounded man won't accept treatment until he's learnt a whole lot of completely irrelevant facts about the arrow and who shot it and so on. And it's often referred to then, this is the second arrow, that, okay, we have bad things happening to us because of where we're born or what country we live in or whatever, but we make it all worse by not meeting that kind of primary suffering by skillfully. In other words, we should accept, putting the kids to bed hungry every night and that sort of thing. I just think it's a very specious argument. And if you want to be serious about Dharmic ethics, about compassion, about generosity, then of course it matters that that we're living under a system that is magnifying inequality and maldistribution of all the essentials of life the whole time. That the gulf between rich and poor is getting bigger and better. In the US, I'm aware, of the whole controversy of the 1% versus the 99%. The 1% are the ones who are cleaning up all the time. So I think there's no. Again, it's these are issues we do have to take on board if we're going to be serious practitioners of Dharma ethics.
Yeah, you talk about that we can't just awaken all on our own anymore. That what we really might need to do in the West or in Western Buddhist circles is develop what you're calling cultures of awakening. And I'm wondering, what does that look like, or how? What's the playbook for that, if there is one?
Well, I'm thinking, when you were putting the question, I was just thinking of my own little Sangha, my own little practice group, Kookaburra Sangha, and there seems to be a kind of mass signing up to Extinction Rebellion and other forms of climate action, which is seen as a seamless extension of how we meet as a Dharma group.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I don't think any of these people would make any have any inhibitions about voting for the Greens, the local Green Party, and being active in that sort of movement. It just seems to me to be that if you are serious about alleviating suffering and about seeing an equitable distribution of wealth, income, and life chances, then you've got to stop being a couch potato or a cushion potato.
Yeah. Didn't the Greeks have a word? I think I saw this idios, meaning someone who is politically disengaged, and that's where the word idiot comes from.
Exactly, an idiot was someone who was politically disengaged.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of Buddhist idiots out there.
Perhaps we could start a sect.
You mentioned the word, I don't know how to pronounce it, pamada, carelessness.
Pamada, yeah.
Pamada.
Yeah.
But you do bring up Michel Foucault and his notion of care for the self. And I'm wondering, how do we avoid moving to sort of, self-care now is a trendy word in the wellness industry. It's all about self-care or self-help. And I'm wondering, what do you see as a difference between care for the self and then sort of kind of a devolving into self-care or self-help?
Well, care for the self, is an idea that started in ancient Greece, and it referred really to how they saw a meaningful human life being one where one developed the virtues, that the development of the virtues including things like not only courage and so forth, but intelligence. And part of it was being, as we've just noted, a non-idiot, being someone who was actually involved in community life and contributing to it. There was no distinction between care of the self and being communally and politically and socially engaged. It was they were sort of all part of the same proposition of living the good life, of constantly questioning what the content of that was. Thinking of Socrates' famous statement that the good life for a human being is constantly returning to the question of what is the good life for a human being. So we need to be avoiding everything that is closing us off, leading to excessive privatisation and bystanderism, if I can bring that word in this context. So when we find care of the self becoming a kind of narcissistic self-care or a solipsistic self-care, I think this is a real perversion of what the term actually means. And again, one can go back to Heidegger. That one of his one really important facet of being human was being with others. He loved to put hyphens between these words. So being with others was an important facet, just like being here or being there or being in the world or being towards death. It was all part and parcel of the same intelligent approach to what we do with this one fragile, precious life.
Yeah, that's really a good way of articulating and putting it. I think that's really clear. And so what's your take, or what's your assessment on, we call it the state of the union here, but the state of Western Buddhism? What's your feeling about it? Is it moving in this direction? I think your work, what you're doing at your Sangha, is emulating this idea of the Dharmic citizen. But what's your standing back? What's your take on where we're at as kind of Western Buddhist communities?
I find it very hard to generalize because one of the problems is, well, what do we mean by Western Buddhism? Are we talking about ethnically Western Dharma practitioners, or are we talking about all manifestations of Buddhism?
Yeah, it's really too broad a term. That's probably right. Yeah.
But I think there are certain. I mean, I think there's growing activism in the community in general around. Obviously, the biggest threat we're facing now is the climate emergency, and I've just noticed how not just my Dharma friends and my own Sangha, but many other of my Dharma friends are all seem to be flocking to Extinction Rebellion, and sometimes to some other really active kind of climate politics. And I see this, it's very hopeful, and it shows that at least Western Buddhism, as these people embody it, is maturing into seeing that being a Dharma practitioner means you have social and political responsibilities.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. I'd like to maybe hear a little bit about how has your interest in social democracy, especially Scandinavian social democracy, how has that influenced the way has it influenced your own way of interpreting and cultivating your own Dharma practice or your own Sangha? That's one question. The second question is, a fantasy is that what if Buddhism had landed in these social democratic countries instead of in capitalist United States? Would we see a different kind of Dharma?
I'm not. It'd be rather courageous to produce any hypotheses about that. But as far as social democracy is concerned, I see a very clear connection between development of Scandinavian social democracy and Buddhist ethics. And I guess, your question was, has that affected me? And the answer is yes, it has. And in particular, I guess I first became interested in the Dharma in the late 1980s. And it was the same time as I was a specialist in kind of Scandinavia watching, and particularly Sweden watching. And I began to wonder how Swedish social democracy got to be so incredibly powerful and got the policy settings right to overcome the depression, the fact that Sweden itself was an incredibly poor backwater of Europe, and then 20 years later emerged as as sort of paragon of how Western society should conduct itself. And there was one, as I sort of drilled down into this, there was one character came up whom I've subsequently written a book about with a good friend, Ernst Wigforss, who was the mastermind of the social democratic breakthrough in Sweden. And he also was a classic bodhisattva. He was never celebrated in those terms, but for anyone who knew what a Bodhisattva was supposed to be, he was it. He was sort of like a supreme anti-Trump. You know, he never told lies. He never used profanities. He was a voracious reader. And
that is definitely anti-Trump, yes.
and he was always, 10 steps ahead of the right-wing opposition, intellectually, rhetorically, and a superb publicist. Is one of the characteristics of a bodhisattva is to be articulate. And, I met old-timers in Sweden who just talked about going to hear a speech by Big Fortune of being a conversion experience.
Wow.
Because he appealed to the intelligence of the audience instead of insulting it, as Trump would do. And so I once had this extraordinary piece of good fortune of managing to infiltrate the archives of the of Swedish radio and dug out some of these debates he'd hold on radio with right-wingers. And they're incredibly polite, but you had to almost feel sorry for the bad guys because they were just stitched up really, really soundly on very, very good intellectual and ethical basis. And this is the man who put his stamp on where Swedish social democracy went from the breakthrough in the early 30s right through to the 1950s. So, I made that connection. And, I still regard myself as a left-wing social democrat in the sort of in Big Fortune's model.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I have been to Sweden, I've been to Finland, and every time that I've been there, walking the streets, I just feel how comfortable and how relaxed people seem to be. I could actually feel it, and it's very interesting. Well, Winton, I want to thank you for joining our podcast. It was a wonderful conversation, and I'm planning on keeping up on what you've been writing. Do you have any new projects that you're working on?
Yes, well, we've, down here south of the equator, we've set up a little imprint called Tuferi, which is a Maori word for a clue or a path. And we've brought out 2 books already, and what I'll be working on soon is just collecting some of my own writings, and that will be published as a book.
Oh, very good. Well,
yeah. So that's, apart from that, I write novels, but they're a bit off to the side, I guess.
Well, you're very prolific, nonfiction and fiction. That's a whole different world. Well, thank you again for joining the podcast, and we will maybe talk again in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
All right. Thank you. In this episode, we've been listening to Winton Higgins, who lives in Sydney, Australia, and began meditating and practicing the Dharma in 1987. He took up teaching mainly Vipassana meditation in 1995, began teaching city classes and silent residential retreats in rural venues. He's a senior teacher for the umbrella body of the Sydney Insight Meditators and One Mindful Breath in Wellington, New Zealand. Winton's meditation teaching has developed towards a non-formulaic insight practice based on the Buddha's original teachings, while his Dharmic orientation inclines towards secular Buddhism. He fosters interest in the original teachings and their affinity with modern streams of thought and progressive social commitments. He is a social science academic specializing in genocide,
social democracy, and political theory, and he is also a novelist. He and his partner, Lena, have 2 daughters, a grandson, and 2 small granddaughters, all living in Sydney, Australia. Again, thank you for listening to the Mindful Cranks. We appreciate your support and interest. It would be really helpful if you could leave us a review on iTunes. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can find our show notes in our webpage, www.mindfulcranks.com. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next episode.